We know all about using forms from earlier on in the course, so this video should not throw up any surprises. However, we're going to look at how Bootstrap handles these forms. It uses exactly the same elements as we've already seen, but then adds some nice styling and positioning by adding the Bootstrap classes. Our modal now pops up on the screen when we click on this sign up button, and inside of this modal is where we're going to add our sign up form. First, we can add some text to the modal header section, which is this top part here. So let's go. Actually, before we do that, if we click off the modal, it'll close it down. And then over to the text editor. Let's scroll down to our modal header section here. And inside of here, I'm going to add a level 5 heading with the text of sign up for exclusive offers. Bootstrap also has some classes available too, and this time this one is called modal title. So save that, and then go over to the modal pop-up, click the button, and there's our text at the very top. Then on to adding our form inside this middle section, which is the body. So back over to our modal. This time, inside of this modal body section, we're going to add a form. This form is going to have a div nested inside with the class of form group. So this groups together all of the form section, including any inputs and labels. We add each input and label inside this form group to add some structure to our form elements, such as any margin to space them out. So let's begin with a label. And this label is going to have the usual 4 attributes, and this is going to link to our input. So let's call this a name input, because we're going to add a name section, and then the text of your name. Then after this label, we can add our input. This is going to have the type of text, and then some classes. So the Bootstrap classes of form control, AID, and this ID is going to be name input, which matches this label. So ID of name input. Then after this, we can add some placeholder text, and this can be anything of our choosing. I'm going to simply type enter your name. Okay, so before we added this Bootstrap class of form control, this is used on any text-based inputs, such as the type of text, select, and text area. This will apply any styles such as colors, and also sets the input to be 100% wide. If we save that, we can see what effect this has inside the modal. So click on the button, and there's our 100% wide input in the middle with the label of your name. This is how our form looks by default. We have the label and input on separate lines. Bootstrap applies the display type of block and a width of 100% to most form elements. If we wanted this label and input to be in line, there is a class for this too. We can add this to the surrounding form container, and the class is called form inline. Save that, and then reload. Click on the modal, and now our label and input is in line. But I'm going to keep this as it originally was, without this class of form inline. So let's remove this for now. And then onto our email and address form groups. So just like this name section here, we also surround other inputs with this class of form group. So let's copy this and then paste it in just below. This one is going to be for the email. So let's change your name to be your email. This is going to have the input type of email to. We also need to change the label for attribute to be email input, which is going to match this ID here. So also change this to be email input. And I think everything else is okay. Just a placeholder. So enter your email. And that's looking good. Just below this email, we're going to paste this in one more time And this is also going to have the surrounding div with the class of form group, but this time it's going to be for your address. This time we're going to have a text area rather than the standard input. So let's delete this input from here. Okay, after this label, we're then going to create the text area. So remember, the text area has an opening and closing tag, and the input just has the self-closing tag. So the text area can have a class of form control, which is the same as these ones above, because it's a text-based input. And then an ID, which matches this label of address. Remember from earlier, with a text input, we can also specify how many rows we want to add. And I'm going to set this to be 3 by default. And then a placeholder with the text of enter your address. Okay, so I think that's us all done for the 3 inputs. So let's see how this is looking. Activate the modal. Okay, good. So we've got the name, the email, and also the address, which is a text area. And we can drag this up and down to make it bigger or smaller. So this just leaves the footer area down at the bottom. Inside of here, I would like to add some checkboxes to ask if the user wants to be contacted by email or post, and then a submit button too to send the form. First, let's add these checkboxes. So down to our modal, this should be modal footer. So make sure that's changed. So we've got the body, the header, and then the footer at the bottom. So let's start with our email and post inputs. So the surrounding div with the Bootstrap classes of form check, because this will be a checkbox, and then form check inline to keep these elements in line. And then we can add our input with the type of checkbox, the Bootstrap classes of form check input. After the class, we're going to add an ID, which is going to link up to our label. And this ID, I'm going to call this the email check. And then finally, a value, which is going to be equal to option 1. And then close this off. Remember, the value is the text which will be sent to the server once this form has been submitted. Okay, so after the input, we need to add our label. And this label is going to have a class of form check label, the for attribute, which is going to link to our ID of the checkbox above, and this was email check. And finally, the text inside of contact by email. Okay, so let's make that a little bit smaller so we can see it all on the screen. And then I'm just going to copy this to speed things up. So make sure you copy this full surrounding div, paste this in just below, and then we can just simply change this one to be contact by post. So the classes are all the same. We just need to check the ID is different. So the ID this time is going to be post check. The for attribute can be post check 2, contact by post, and let's just add a question mark after each one of them. And then finally, let's wrap up this modal with a button to submit the form. The text of submit, the type of submit to, the Bootstrap classes of btn, and then btn primary, which will give it the blue color for the button. So that should be all now for the footer. We've got our 2 checkboxes here, and then our submit button. So let's take a look at this in action. Activate the pop-up. Okay, so the footer content is now there, but it looks a little out of place. We can quickly fix this with a little flexbox. Rather than adding our flexbox in our CSS file, Bootstrap also provides us with some utility classes we can use to add flexbox in really quickly. So over to our code, And then we can add a Flexbox CSS helper inside this modal footer div. So just after modal footer, we can add justify content between. And this works exactly like justify content between did in our CSS, but Bootstrap provides it inside of a CSS class. So save that and over to our modal. And there we go. So now things are nicely spaced out in the footer. This is just like what we've already learned. We can also replace between with center, start, end, and around, for example 2. The only difference is here we're using a class provided by Bootstrap. Under the hood, it's still applying a CSS style property, just like we did early in the course. If we were to open up the developer tools, and then scroll down. If we then inspect this footer area of the modal, click on this, we can see this class of justify content between, which we added just here, is simply applying the justify content flexbox property to this element. So let's close this down. Okay, so now if we go back over to our HTML, if we take a look at the surrounding form inside the modal, so the form element, there's the closing tag, and there's the opening tag. You notice that this form element needs to be moved to surround all of our form elements. At the moment, it only surrounds this body content of name, email, and address. So let's cut this closing form tag out of here. And then if we move this down, let's move this right down to the bottom. So make sure it has the button with the type of submit. And then we can add this in just after the footer section. So now all of our inputs are now inside this form element. Just to finish things off, I'm going to add a button on the form, which is just going to be an X. So the user can click to close the modal. You can also click off the screen to close the modal like we've seen before, but sometimes a user may not know that they can do this. So a little cross in the corner of the form will really benefit. I'm going to add this in the modal header section. So let's scroll up to the modal header part here, and then we can add a button. So just after this H5, let's add a button. And then we can add a HTML entity, which is going to be a symbol of times. And this is going to be a little cross, which we'll see in just a moment. So the button needs a type of button, a class of close, and then data dismiss of modal. So data dismiss of modal will declare we want this button to close the modal when it's clicked. So we'll give that a save and we can try this out over in the browser. Reload, open up the modal, and there's our HTML entity, which is the cross. Click on this, and now this closes down our modal. This is our modal now fully functional, and also the form now looking better. As with all elements and components we've used so far, check out the Bootstrap documentation for some variants and some different ways we can use them, along with any sample code to get us going. Next, we're going to look at Bootstrap spacing utilities to add margin and padding.